Here. I want to welcome you to the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. I'm Jan Gibson, and I'm the program chairman. Our mission is to protect the historic visual character of Lake Forest. Today we have a very special guest, Stephen Salny, as you know. Stephen's an Adler expert, and he fell in love with Adler's work while he was a student at Lake Forest College. He has lectured, written articles, and has written now 2 books on Adler, about Adler, The Country Houses of David Adler, and the newest, the Francis-Elkins Interior Design. And with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Stephen Salny. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, it's wonderful to lecture on David Adler, Francis Elkins. It's especially wonderful to be lecturing here in Lake Forest because this is where it all started many years ago. In 1973, I left Boston, where I grew up, to come to college to major in economics. I was being groomed from birth to take over a family real estate investment management business, which I took over and I still run. But my real interest, besides majoring in economics, was to drive around Lake Forest looking at houses, probably many times when I should have been in classes. My friends were on campus partying, and I was getting locked up at the Lake Forest Police Department for trespassing. But what happened was I was establishing this love affair with houses throughout Lake Forest without knowing that they were all by one architect. I found this out towards the middle of my senior year when a classmate of mine showed me the first book on David Adler by Richard Pratt, and as I'm going through the book, I realized that every house that I had loved was by David. So I approached Franz Schultz, my mentor and teacher in art and architecture, and asked him if I could do an independent study on David Adler before I graduated 4 months later. So he said yes. He said we should talk every 3 or 4 weeks, and when it's over, you'll hand me in the paper, and I'll grade it, and hopefully you'll get your credit. Well, at the time I decided to do the paper, I wrote every homeowner on the North Shore of Chicago, and I explained to them what I was doing, and every family gave me carte blanche with their houses for 4.5 months, and there were numerous visits, and I can assure you, numerous phone calls. Some people changed their telephone numbers. And I turned the paper into Franz 4.5 months later, and he called me into his office the next day, and he said to me, well, you've been my student for 4 years. Sometimes you were great, sometimes you were average, and sometimes you were just plain lousy. He said, but this paper is unbelievable. He said, you will write a book on this man someday. And I said, oh, Franz, I don't think so. And he said, yes, you will. Well, 18 years later, David Adler came back into my life in 1995, and I got back to working on studying Adler and researching. And at this point, I was now dealing with children and grandchildren and some great-grandchildren of the owners. And the book on Adler was published 4 years ago. And with that behind me, I felt that it was very important to write a book on Francis Elkins. David and Francis, as you see up here on the screen, this is Francis Elkins. Really, they were not an official partnership, but they did a great deal of work together. And David was Francis's mentor, the single most important influence on his sister. When they grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If you want to dim the lights, that would be great. Thank you. David was 6 years older than Francis. He was born in 1882. They were raised in a very prominent, affluent family in Milwaukee. The Adler family, they were in the clothing business. The parents, Teresa and Isaac David Adler, the parents, they expressed that their children should travel, they should study the arts, the classics, so there were trips to Europe and a very, very wonderful education. Well, David ended up going to Lawrenceville School in Princeton and then to Princeton University, and he graduated in 1904. Well, David set his sights on studying architecture in Europe. First he went to Munich, and then he went to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. But it took him two tries to get into the École, which of course was typical of Americans. Richard Morris Hunt, the Beaux-Arts trained architect, he was the first American to attend, and it took him two tries to get into this school. So David finally got it in 1908, and Frances took advantage of the opportunity to visit her brother as often as possible, and she went over to Paris, and brother and sister traveled a great deal. She traveled without him, and Frances, through her travels, met many avant-garde artisans who were themselves starting out in their own creative fields. People like Alberto and Diego Giacometti, the furniture designer, decorator Jean-Michel Franck, and couturier Coco Chanel. But this was a time when people like this were inaugurating their own careers, and Frances had a propensity to always seek out and find the best. She had a terrific eye. Thank you. Yeah, she had a terrific eye, and she knew how to discover great people, not just in Europe but also in the United States. Well, in 1918, in 1911, David returned to Chicago and he set up his architectural practice. By 1917, Frances, who you see here, this painting was done in 1920. She was 32 at the time. It was painted by her friend Eugenia McComas, who was a prominent Monterey, California artist and muralist. In 1918, having moved to California, she met a man named Felton Elkins, who was from Philadelphia. He was a wealthy playwright, polo player, socialite. They married, and in 1918, they decided to settle in Monterey, California. Well, they purchased this crumbling historic adobe, Casa Mesti, for $5,000. Well, as you see this now, the house has been completely restored, but at the time it was crumbling and in terrible condition. When Frances showed the house to her very good friend Hester Griffin, and the Griffins were part of the inner circle of Pebble Beach. Pebble Beach was just being founded at the time. And she drove by the house with Frances, and she said, "It's a dump. You overpaid by $5,000. Well, Frances, who was never short on self-assurance, said to her very dear friend, "When my brother and I finish restoring Casa Mesti, it will become the showplace of Northern California." Well, brother and sister set about restoring the house. There was no indoor plumbing, there were no closets, there was no interior staircase. The house, interior and outside, was just in the worst condition possible. Well, Frances, from her travels, started to decorate the house. This is the sala on the second floor of the house. David Adler added the classical details, the window casings, the dental cornice, the overmantel. However, he did this without diminishing the patina of the adobe architecture, the highly polished redwood floors, the stucco walls, and the plank ceiling. Their goal was not to change the style of the house, but to add sort of an eclectic bent to it, both in architecture and interior design. Well, this photograph, this is how the room appeared in 1918. This was unheard of at that time. Decorating really was not an established field in this country, and decorating at that time was very dull and boring, and colors were very muted. So this room, to Frances Elkins' friends, was absolutely revolutionary. She mixed, for instance, Chinese carpets, English antique partner's desk, French provincial ladder-back chairs, vibrant color, the blues, the yellows, and the whites. This was just something that was unheard of at this time. Well, as Casa Mesti was evolving, and here you see the overmantel that David Adler purchased in England, but here there are a pair of George III demi-lune console tables, a pair of 18th century double-gored silkwork panels. her friends would visit, and they were so overwhelmed by what she had done. Hester Griffin, in particular, asked her to do her house in Pebble Beach, which she was building at the time, and you'll see that shortly. Frances had never intended to be a decorator. It just happened. Her friends in Pebble Beach, her brother was the rage in Chicago and Lake Forest. So between the two of them, they pulled her into this profession. At that time, her marriage had also gone by the wayside, so she needed to supplement her family income by working. This is the dining room, which is connected to the sala. Here, she combined Louis XVI dining room table, George III demi-lune table and mirror, Ming Dynasty plates, the vibrant mustard yellow curtains that were trimmed in a royal blue or a medium blue. David Adler, who spent a great deal of time in Monterey with his sister, he lived in Chicago and in Libertyville, and he had his own bedroom. This was called David Adler's bedroom. One of the things he had to do in renovating this house is he had to add closets and a bathroom. So in his bedroom, by adding 3 closets and a bathroom, he established a pair of niches. You'll see this is the bed niche, and there is a dressing niche across the way. Frances loved the toile fabric, the toile de Jouy fabric. This is Les Monuments de Paris. So she papered the walls in this fabric. The bed is an American bird's eye canopy bed, and she utilized the same fabric as in the dining room for the curtains and the bed trimmings. But again, you see a Regency bench, and you see the Chinese carpets. And this is the dressing table or the dressing niche, and to perpetuate the window treatment in the room, she treated this as if it was a window. The crenellated canopy or valance as was on the bed and the other valance, and she also lined this niche with the toile. And then this is a Regency walnut commode and a pair of Louis XVI stools. The second floor hallway, to expand the visual parameters of the hallway, and the hallway led to the sala and to the dining room and to David's bedroom as well as Frances's suite. She papered in a vibrant directoire wallpaper called Le Palais Royal. She obviously loved the blues and the grays, and this was a consistent theme throughout the house. For chandeliers, she had wicker baskets painted and wired for lighting. Frances's bedroom was rather muted. This is actually a watercolor that was painted by the late, great legendary decorator Mark Hampton. Mark published a wonderful book about 15 years ago called Legendary Decorators of the 20th Century, and he had a tremendous affinity for Frances Elkins. So this was one of his watercolors that appeared in the book. The bedspread was a shell pink. There was a fur throw at the foot of the bed, the cotton, a white shag rug. The bed is a white lacquered four-poster, and Frances, who was very innovative, just used fishnet for the canopy with tassels and fringe. And here you see the influence of Giacometti with the ceiling fixture and the sconces. And she marbleized, she did a faux marble for the mantle and the baseboard. But just for a touch of vibrant color, here on a French chair, she used a vibrant red velvet fabric for the seat cover. In 1944, David decided, and Frances decided, that she wanted a garden room or solarium. So he designed this room to extend the house and also to perpetuate the relationship between the house and the garden, which was very important to David and very important to the philosophy of the Beaux-Arts education that he received in France. Well, again, you see the continuation of the blue and white color scheme, the Chinese Peking rug. This is a dark blue and white hand-block linen from Germany. The desk is where Frances sat when she worked at home, and the quilted fabric on the Louis XV chairs, and here's a Louis XVI chair. What's interesting about this room is these are, you see these are mullions, but the mullions are not on top of the glass. Each shape is cut out individually for the window. The men's club that has occupied this building since 1955, Frances died in 1953, and she left Casa Mesti to the National Trust. They said that every time, not that it happens too often, but they say it is cost prohibitive when one of these windows breaks because they have to have the glass custom made to fit into the pattern that you see here. Well, the garden was very important to Frances and David. They traveled to Spain. There was a garden in the Alhambra near Seville called the Lindaraje Garden. It was very symmetrical. David Adler's architecture was known for its symmetry. Frances's rooms were known for their symmetry. So here you have this balanced garden. You can see the solarium, and you can see the overhanging balcony which wrapped around the second floor of the house, which typified this Spanish Revival architecture. And this is another photograph of the garden taken from the outbuilding that David Adler designed for his sister. Hester Griffin, who I mentioned earlier, was one of Frances Elkins' closest friends. She and her first husband, Arthur Haitley, built the first large house in Pebble Beach in 1926. The Griffin Estate was designed by Santa Barbara architect George Washington Smith, very prominent architect in California, and it stood on 25 acres. The property was so vast it contained a formal English garden and sheep. The Griffins loved sheep on the property. Well, this house was, Mrs. Griffin referred to this as her cottage. Well, this cottage was about 30 rooms, and the decorating on this house took 6 years and many, many trips to Europe with Mrs. Elkins. The living room, which was basically in shades of bone black and yellow, Frances accented it with a shocking peach-colored corduroy fabric for the camelback sofa and twin pair of armchairs. This is 1926. This is unheard of in those days. The Coromandel screens that you see balancing the fireplace were a favorite of Frances Elkins. This gilded standing lamp that you see, it's a twisted columnar lamp, was by Salvador Dali. The close-up shows the symmetry of arrangement of furniture centered on the fireplace. You can get a better look at the Persian rug. The mantel is pine. These chests are stripped pine as well. In the late 40s, Alan Griffin, who owned the Monterey Peninsula Herald, he was given a diplomatic post in China. Well, this excited both Mrs. Griffin and Mrs. Elkins, because Mrs. Elkins gave her very dear friend a very, very long shopping list of everything that she and her husband were to buy in China. Well, I can assure you, between Mrs. Elkins' requirements, Mrs. Griffin's taste, and great taste and unlimited budget, her grandchildren, who are now in their middle 50s, are still opening crates that Grandma never got to in the shipments that came back from China. Well, they bought lots of artifacts in Cambodia. They bought these bronze busts. They bought a pair of Chinese lacquered tray tables. There's an identical one on the opposite side of the window. These windows overlooked Mrs. Griffin's formal boxwood garden. The Han Dynasty vase came from that period. And then the pair of Queen Anne mirrors were purchased by Frances and Hester on one of their many, many trips to Europe. There was a game table in the living room. This chair became a signature chair for Frances Elkins. It was derived from the original chair that she purchased in England for the Kersey Coates Reed House in Lake Forest. Frances had great craftspeople in this country. Her brother introduced her to William J. Quigley in Chicago, who was the preeminent, custom furniture maker and upholsterer in the city of Chicago. He actually had a shop here in Lake Forest as well. And anything that David Adler and Frances Elkins needed to be duplicated, Quigley could do that. Also in Monterey, Francis had befriended many craftsmen. There was a man named Myron Oliver who also made custom furniture for Francis. She was famous for shipping back original pieces, giving them to Quigley or to Myron Oliver, and just telling them to hold on to it, and she just copied it continually for her clients. Also, the game table was copied from the Reed Commission. Now here you see a Chippendale drum table next to a Chippendale settee, but here is a Giacometti plaster lamp. Again, it was unheard of. Putting a Giacometti item on a Chippendale table, often Francis would finish it off by putting a 25-cent ashtray next to it from Mexico. The Griffin dining room, known for its vibrant hand-painted wallpaper that they found in Versailles in a very vibrant blue and green. The rug was custom-made in Lisbon, and the Chippendale chairs are upholstered in a very pale blue, robin's egg blue leather. Hester Griffin collected porcelains. She collected Royal Danish porcelains and Picasso. This is one of a pair of Picasso urns. On the Sheraton sideboard, there were several pieces from China, a pair of Ming chargers, and then Mrs. Griffin had a tremendous collection of heirloom silver, candlesticks, samovar, etc. Well, this is, for those of you who know Lake Road and Lake Forest, this is the Plum House on Lake Road. This was David Adler and Francis Elkins' most successful commission. This house was built in 1931 for Mrs. Kersey Coates Reed. David Adler had been hired by the Reeds in the late 20s to design a tennis house with an indoor tennis court, which you'll see shortly. The property of their estate was on the east and west sides of Lake Road. Well, standing on this property originally was a house that had been built, well, actually it wasn't built in the middle 1800s. Abram Poole lived in the house. Abram's son was a very good friend of David's from Princeton and the École. Well, the Reeds lived in this house for several summer seasons. They built the tennis house, and then they decided by the late 20s that the house needed too much care, so they decided to take it down and asked David to build a Pennsylvania Dutch stone house. Well, unfortunately, because this picture is not in color, you cannot see, but the mica stone shimmers like diamonds. And I always used to say, Harry Winston should have seen this house because the facade shimmered more than the diamonds in his salon. Well, the interior of the house is anything but Pennsylvania Dutch. This is an entrance vestibule, and the symmetry of design, you can see the pair of Georgian eagle-based console tables and mirrors, the pair of leather benches. This was to establish that the house was going to be as symmetrical inside as it was outside. David Adler, he loved the lake, and he wanted the visitor to feel that potent light from the lake was going to come and shoot into the vestibule. So you always knew when you entered a house on the lake that you were on the lake. Well, this particular vestibule is famous for its twin balancing powder rooms. This is the ladies' powder room. Absolutely one of the most exquisite rooms Mrs. Elkins ever did. The wainscoting is a yellow lacquered. This is all silver leaf. The floor is an ebonized wood floor, and if you can see these inserted squares, they are of Monel metal, which is a polished amalgam of nickel and copper. The room was lit with indirect lighting, so when you walk into it, between the mirrors and the lighting, it just comes alive. The other thing that I realized after going into many Elkins interiors is that her moldings were always out of Steuben glass. And the first time I saw it, I thought, well, how unusual. But by about the 20th interior that I'd seen she did, I just realized, well, that was just stock material for her. Across the hall is a gentleman's cloakroom. The room is anchored in antique French parquetry. And the furnishings and accessories are by Jean-Michel Franck and Alberto Giacometti. There's a bas-relief that you cannot see in this photograph by Giacometti. This was a precursor to the decor for the library in this house. Well, of course, the vestibule opens up into this very, very imposing, magnificent gallery. When you enter this room, you know that you have arrived. I have been to this house by myself. I have been to this house when there are 800 people in it. I have been to this house for book signings. I've been to this house so many times, the current owners have practically given me a key in a bedroom for the house. Well, the pièce de résistance is David Adler's staircase, which he was famous for, but this particular one was his greatest staircase. The balusters here are wrought glass. The Moroccan runner was a favorite of Francis Elkins, and the columns are black Belgian marble. All the main rooms, or the principal rooms of the house, face Lake Michigan. The living room, which is the most traditional room in the house, the Persian tapestries. Frances, when she purchased them for Mrs. Reed, thought them to be too much color, so she bleached them. Of course, that destroyed any value to them, but of course, this is what Mrs. Elkins wanted, and Mrs. Reed had great respect for Francis Elkins, and that's what she did. Chintzes were a big favorite of Mrs. Elkins, so you see the glazed chintz that she used for the overstuffed armchairs and sofa. The library, which was the greatest interior of Mrs. Elkins of her entire career, another collaboration between her and Jean-Michel Franck and his partner Adolphe Chenot. The room was designed in Paris and assembled in the United States. The walls are covered in Hermes goatskin. You can see the seams. They are rectangular panels of goatskin that have been adhered to the wall and sewn together with a tan stitchery. This was to emulate paneling, but of course it was in goatskin. Franck did the sofa, the tables. This is one of 3 tables in a tortoiseshell lacquer. All the books in the room were covered in parchment where the titles were cut out because Mrs. Elkins wanted nothing to compete with the monochromatic color scheme in this room. You can see the original Queen Anne chairs that were copied for Mrs. Griffin's game table. At the fireplace, the mantle, and the doors and door casings were purchased by David in England, as well as Elkins found these antique Queen Anne wing chairs. They were upholstered in a pale beige pettipoint. This is another Franck tortoise lacquered table, and of course the requisite Persian rugs that have been bleached, sitting on antique parquetry. Another view of the library. You can see another Franck chair, another pair of chairs, the game table. This is a Tang Dynasty groomsman that's been recessed into the niche, and an English partner's desk. But here again, the combination of avant-garde with tradition, a Jean-Michel Franck lamp. Mark Hampton, when he wrote about this room in his book, said this was the most incredibly chic room he had ever seen in the country. Not warm, not cozy, but incredibly chic. The North Hall connects the staircase, the stair hall, with the dining room. This was more or less a sitting room or reception room. But here, Frances introduced one of her favorite materials, again, the ebonized floor, and she used the Monel metal here for the fretwork insert. Well, David was very conservative and straight-laced. His sister was very avant-garde. He didn't always approve of what she did when she wasn't working with him. She did her best work with David. He tempered her. He kept her in line. He allowed her the classical elements of the avant-garde in this house. She always wanted his approval. She always asked for it, but I can assure you, even when she didn't get it, she just did exactly what she wanted to do. The dining room, noted for its hand-painted chinoiserie wallpaper, The chocolate brown fretwork rug was designed by the great textile aficionado Marion Dorn. Marion did a great deal of rugs for Mrs. Elkins. She also worked for the great English designer Siri Mom. Obviously, this is all antique, Chippendale and antique furniture. The chairs are a Regency-style bamboo-painted chair. David Adler detailed all the pine woodwork in a Chinese Chippendale style to reflect the chairs. This is a bay, the breakfast room bay, which looked out to Lake Michigan. And of course, you see another rug by Marion Dorn. The ivory room, Mrs. Reed had 3 guest suites in her house. The most important guest room was called the ivory room because of its 7.5-foot tall ivory posted canopy beds. The assemblage of these posts are sterling silver. The embroidered bedspreads are from the middle 1700s. The rugs are antique Russian silk needlepoint, so fragile that Mrs. Reed required her staff to remove their shoes when they cleaned the room. The walls are covered in silver tea paper. Francis, who was one of the first to import country French or French provincial into this house, took a French provincial commode and she had it silvered. This is a close-up, you can see, of the rug and the bed, and there are a pair of Venetian cartouche mirrors which add to the luster and the reflection of this room. The accompanying guest bathroom, Francis paved the floors in a green and white plaid marble. The walls are covered in a hand-painted chinoiserie paper in sepia and white. You'll see that she duplicated both the floor and the paper in other houses, and then she used the same Queen Anne detailing that she used in the ladies' powder room. The second floor contained many magnificent bedrooms. This was Mary Reed's bedroom, Mrs. Reed's daughter's bedroom. Again, the room is upholstered in, actually is wallpapered in a hand-painted wallpaper, chinoiserie wallpaper. The oval rug or the round rug is most probably by Marion Dorn. We have, it's a very similar pattern, the fretwork pattern. The chair, armchair, and the settee are Hepplewhite. And just, you see the symmetry of arrangement. A pair of mahogany dumbwaiters balancing a Chippendale fireside bench. This is the tennis house, which was built several years before the main house. This is on the west side of Lake Road, standing with the formal gardens. Mary Reed was an avid tennis player, so this was a very, very generous facility for her to play tennis in and practice. Also, Forest Hills, whenever they came to Lake Forest to play it on Wednesday, they were graciously invited by Mrs. Reed to practice on her court. So for Mr. and Mrs. Reed, David Adler designed a Georgian-style tennis building, very symmetrical. The house is, the epicenter of the tennis house was, or is, the lounge. David was famous for his bleached pine-paneled libraries. Of course, this was not a library, but this was a very appropriate paneling for this particular room. It was inspired by the Hewlett Room at the American Wing at the Metropolitan. David also used the same detailing when he did William McCormick Blair's dining room at Crabtree Farm. It's not in the bleached pine, but it's the same detailing with the fluted pilasters and the double capped cornice here. The living room area of the tennis house, the rugs are not original to Mrs. Elkins' design scheme. And by the way, these pictures that you're seeing of the tennis house are new pictures. This house is 98% original to how it was when Mrs. Elkins left it in 1928. The parchment table is by Jean-Michel Franck, and the French doors open up to a spectator's balcony. And just fix your eyes on this, because you'll see that Adler sunk the tennis court 10 feet below ground by siting the tennis house into a ravine. So here is the spectator's balcony, ground level. The court is clay, the walls are covered in ivy, and the roof is glass. The ladies' changing room was done in Art Deco. The walls are flexwood, which is a veneer mounted on cloth. The wainscoting, or the chair rail actually, and the door casings, this is all mirrored trim. Franck did the dressing table and stools. Each corner contains a set of either built-ins or faux built-ins because they balanced each corner. David and Francis would never have put something in one corner and not put it in the other three. Well, although this corner is on the angle, the drawers open straight into the room. So if you were looking down into the drawer, it's cut on the bias. This is the original raw silk from 1929 on the chaise longue, and the lamp and table are by Franck. The gentleman's changing room, which is the balancing room to the ladies' changing room, is also done in Art Deco. The floor is paved in zenitherm, which is an imitation stone. It was very popular at that time period. David Adler and other architects used it a great deal. The furniture is also by Franck. This is another chair, table, and lamp by Franck as well. Well, David Adler only worked for Chicago families, and David in particular was really not necessarily for hire. You could express interest in having him design your house, but he quickly turned the tables and interviewed you as a prospective client. And you had to pass his muster in order to have him work for you. It wasn't about wealth, because all his clients were wealthy. It was about taste. If you didn't have taste, he wasn't going to work for you. Jane Dick, who built a wonderful house a Greek Revival house on Woodland Road in Lake Forest, many of you probably know it. When I met with her when I was in college, she was at that time shuttling back and forth between the UN and Lake Forest. She had been doing a lot of campaign work early on in her life for Adlai Stevenson. She said to me, David Adler was at our wedding. We went up to him at the reception. Eddie and I went up to him at the reception and said, all we dream of is having a house designed by you. Well, she said it took her 2 years to get up enough nerve to bring him the 3 ballroom-size dress boxes full of clippings that she and Eddie had collected over the years to show David what kind of house they wanted. And she said she sat at home waiting for the phone to ring, shaking in her boots, fearing that he would reject them as clients. Now, of course, he didn't, but she said here was our friend, and we thought for sure he was going to turn us down for lack of taste or good taste. Well, in Long Island, this was the house of Evelyn Marshall Field. Evelyn Field was married to Marshall Field III. They lived in Chicago for a very short time. Evelyn Marshall was from New York, and she insisted that they move back to New York. Well, they built in the city across from the Frick Museum on 70th an imposing Georgian townhouse in 1925 that Adler designed for them. It was a small place. It had a live-in staff of 40 on the top 2 floors. And at the same time, she and Mr. Field purchased 1,200 acres of real estate in Lloyd's Neck, Long Island. And they hired John Russell Pope to design Comset, which was a very large Georgian house. The estate contained a farm, stables, guest house, playhouse. I remember interviewing one of the Field granddaughters, and she said, we used to love to go visit, Grandpa and Bunny. Bunny was Evelyn Field. They always had a lot of staff. They never had a staff of under 120 people. Says, my grandfather was raised in England. He believed in service. Well, when Evelyn and Marshall got divorced, Evelyn got the townhouse in the city, and she purchased, with her settlement, 85 acres of prime property in Muttontown on the North Shore of Long Island's Gold Coast. And she and David Adler, this is in 1931, she and David Adler went on a trip down to Virginia, to Williamsburg. They went to Robert E. Lee's birthplace, Stratford Hall, which was the major inspiration for her house called Easton, and she wanted a country house because she had lost Comset. Well, so David set about designing this house, much more, much more, human scale than Comstead. I mean, Comstead was probably 4 or 5 times the size of this house. This is obviously a red brick Georgian. It's set on an English basement, very similar to Stratford Hall. And it is fronted by not necessarily an oval and not necessarily a rectangular forecourt, but what's crucial to understanding this is these elm trees. Evelyn Field insisted that she was not going to wait for her elm trees to mature. So she made an arrangement with Nassau County that all the power lines between Amityville and her estate would be shut down, taken down in the middle of the night. And triple crews would be working nonstop to transport these elm trees that had already grown to a certain level. The deal was that by morning the power lines had to be put back on, and Joe Q. Public could have breakfast by electric. Well, Innocenti and Webble, who were great landscape architects of Long Island, the forecourt is the cover of their book, which came out a few years ago. They're no longer living, but the firm survives. And there is a picture of the trucks carting these elm trees across Long Island to Mrs. Field's house in the middle of the night. Well, the interior of the house, the flooring is anything but Robert E. Lee had in his house. Of course, you see the repetition of the flooring from Mrs. Reed's North Hall. However, you see the classical arcade of David Adler. So it was a combination of the avant-garde with the classical, and the Georgian pedestal tables and bullseye mirror and the Queen Anne channel tufted leather wing chair. The living room, which was the most traditional room in the house, was anchored by antique parquetry. There were no rugs in this room. This was strictly Evelyn Field's summer house. She sold the townhouse in the city, ended up buying a very large triplex at River House on East 53rd for her winter home or weekday home. She only used this house during the summer. In the winter time, it would be closed up. There was a winter cottage on the property, which would enable her to come out for the weekend or overnight if she had to during the winter. The furnishings in this room are all Chippendale. The upholstery is a quilted glazed chintz. David and Francis loved quilted chintz because it gave dimension to the fabric, but it also gave durability to the wear of it. This is an off-white ground. The flowers are in a pale brown and beige. The curtains are in an off-white raw silk, and they are fringed in a silk tassel. Again, you see the Coromandel screens, but here you see another pair of Giacometti plaster lamps set on Chippendale drum tables. Another view of the living room shows a pair of serpentine-fronted Chippendale commodes, again acting as pedestals for a pair of Giacometti cup and ball vases. And you see another Giacometti lamp here. The dining room, which was in colors of pale gray, white, and yellow. The larger dining chairs were in white leather. The smaller tufted side chairs were in gray leather. The curtains are a mandarin yellow silk. The gadroon cornices are in plaster. The chandelier and sconces are Waterford. And the plaster palm pilasters, which are inspired by Giacometti, sprout from a latticed dado. The fireplace is paved in Steuben glass, the mantel is. These are a pair of silvered candle stands. You can see the antique parquetry and a burnished Chippendale mirror. The porch was very important to David Adler and to his clients. Some of his houses were air-conditioned, some of them were not. In Lake Forest here, the Lasker House, which was another very large and important commission from the middle 20s. Of course, Mr. Lasker was in the advertising business, and Frigidaire had asked if they could air condition his house as a test for the company. Well, Mrs. Field, when she visited, and her family, they spent a great deal of time on the porch. This overlooked her wooded acreage. Again, this was 85 acres. This is the loop chair, which was another important chair of Francis Elkins. This was copied from an Italian prototype. The large wicker chairs are painted white and upholstered in a vibrant yellow. Barbara Field's bedroom, her eldest daughter. Again, she repeated the canopy bed and canopy from her bedroom in Monterey. And this is a china blue and white glazed chintz that she used for the upholstery and the wall covering. Mrs. Field's bathroom, you see the plaid floor that she used in Mrs. Reed's guest bathroom. And then she used the glazed chintz in the Lilies of the Valley pattern. Well, the period of the Great House was coming to an end by the middle 30s. And David Adler was winding down on the big houses. Well, two houses that he was asked to design in the middle 30s. This is one of them. This is for Mr. and Mrs. Leslie Wheeler on Mayflower Road. And although the house is certainly not small, the house is very deceiving because the house really grows as you move through the interior. Well, the centerpiece of the front elevation is this Gothic arched portico that was derived from a house in England. The epicenter of the house and one of the most magnificent libraries that Adler designed with his sister, this was the library. You can see the antique parquetry that they purchased in England. The room was divided into three compartments, separated by Queen Anne bookcases that projected into the room, the rounded hoods. All the fabrics in this room were in muted bones and beiges. The center compartment, which was focused on the fireplace, you see the Queen Anne detail over mantel, and then you see the overstuffed lounge chairs, which are upholstered in a beige linen. The living room, which was decorated in blue and off-white. The rugs were designed with the fretwork pattern by Francis Elkins. Here you can see the game chairs again, the loop chairs. Adler designed the wooden cornices to emulate the frame of an antique mirror that stood on the opposite side of the room. All the upholstery in the room was in shades of blue. Here are a pair of Adam pedestals with Giacometti vases on them, and here's another Giacometti lamp. The sitting area of the living room was focused on the fireplace, which was accented with Kongshi porcelains and antique wall brackets. And then you see the arrangement of accessories. You see a Dr. Walwister soup tureen, a pair of 15th century ceramic camels. But look at the exactitude and placement of these accessories. Mrs. Elkins, when she did your house, she not only left the client with a floor plan of where all the furniture went, but she also left you a plan of every tabletop in the house showing where every accessory was to go, including the types and the number of stems of flowers to go in each vase. Mrs. Elkins had a key to every one of her clients' houses. They understood that she could show up anytime unannounced to do what she called her inspections. If she found things out of place, if she found that you had put things in the room that she hadn't approved of, out they came, and you could have been in Europe and they were taken out pronto. She was also known to come in, and if she thought your room looked tired or in need of a new piece of furniture, she would take care of that and send you the bill. And if you argued with her, she reminded you that you were privileged, she was doing your house. Now, she was sensitive to her clients' needs. She was very good at matching her clients' personality with their homes, but she was in charge of the ship. The Wheeler dining room was anchored in another zenithorm floor, that imitation stone in black. The center medallion and the border was in a buff white. The Queen Anne chairs are a combination of original and copies that William Quigley made because they could not find enough for the dining table and the breakfast table. The curtains, again, are in that Chinese yellow. The plaster cornices added a bit of the exotic to the room. And the British artist Glyn Philpott did a series of murals, of this being one, that were abstract, and they were in shades of mustard green and black. Well, Francis, of course, did a lot of work in Pebble Beach, San Francisco, in addition to Chicago and Lake Forest. In the 1915, Mr. and Mrs. Fuller commissioned Beaux-Art architect Arthur Brown to design a Georgian house perched at the pinnacle of Pacific Heights on Broadway, overlooking San Francisco Bay. Now, of course, you can see that if you go off the terrace, you're likely to end up in the bay. Well, in 1937, James and Hannah Zellerbach bought the house from the Fullers. And of course, if you lived in California, you lived on the West Coast, there was only one person to hire, and that was Frances Elkins. And they used to say if she turned you down as a client, you were better off leaving the state rather than admit that she wouldn't work for you. Well, the Zellerbachs gave her carte blanche with their house. People told Frances, you don't dare alter the interior of an Arthur Brown house. It's a shrine. And she said, okay. And then she set about doing exactly what she wanted. Well, the entrance vestibule was rather traditional. She papered it in the requisite chinoiserie paper. This is a Persian runner. These are Queen Anne window seats upholstered in a pale green leather. The dining room, which overlooks Broadway, the walls were pickled oak. The Scalamandre fabric was in a pale beige. Baguez, who was the prominent metalsmith in Paris, who fashioned magnificent chandeliers and sconces, did the chandelier here. But the colors were kept rather muted in this room. Across the entrance vestibule was the library, very traditional, also in a very pale salmony beige color scheme. The furnishings, the desks, the chairs, they're all English, and of course you have the glazed quilted chintz. But the tradition stopped in those two rooms. The gallery to the Zellerbach house was anchored by a series of Moroccan runners in a strict color scheme of pale blue and white. The room was also anchored by a plaster-based console and mirror by the great designer Emilio Terry, who did a lot of work for Jean-Michel Franck. Jean-Michel Franck had a shop in Paris. Mrs. Elkins was the only person in the United States who was allowed to import his work. She was also allowed to copy it. She was also allowed to copy Giacometti's work in this country. She had molds by which she could copy the lamps and tables. Well, she also spent a great deal of time in Venice. She did a lot of work with the great glassmaking firm Salviati. So here's a Venetian vase. Another view of the gallery. It shows the expansiveness looking towards the entrance vestibule. The ceilings in this gallery were much taller, and this side of the hallway were covered in had transoms. Well, Frances Elkins came in, she waved her magic wand, the ceilings were lowered and the transoms were filled in because she wanted to line her gallery with the plaster palm pilasters that she had used. Fortuny fabric was used for the curtains. This overlooked the west terrace. Well, here we have another magnificent glassed ladies' powder room. I'm happy to say that the pictures of this room, as well as Mrs. Zellerbach's dressing room and bathroom on the second floor, are new pictures. The current owners have preserved these rooms. When Hannah Zellerbach died in 1993, although she argued a great deal with Mrs. Elkins about things that she had bought for her and things that the way that she had charged her, when Hannah Zellerbach died in 1993, the house was 98% original to the way Frances Elkins left it in 1937. One way Elkins assured this is she often ordered fabrics in duplicate or triplicate, with clear instructions that even after her death, that they were to use the same fabrics and not to make any changes when the fabrics wore out. And I can assure you there were bolts of fabric in some of the closets of these houses that were never used. This is a close-up of the wainscoting, which is a pale sea green. This is silver leaf. The shafts of wheat are also lacquered in silver. Unfortunately, the parquetry, which you can't see, was purchased from the eminent decorator Elsie de Wolf, who was retiring around the time Mrs. Elkins was decorating this house. Well, of course, you can see the paltry view from the Zellerbach living room. The first time I went to this house, the owner of the house came in and she saw me standing paralyzed looking out the window, and she said, "Are you okay, Steve?" And I said, "Well, I just can't get over the view here." Well, of course, you see Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, the Palace of Fine Arts. Frances was very wise. She kept the colors close to the floor so as not to compete with the view. All the fabrics were predominantly creams and off-whites. In this interior, she elected not to bleach the Persian tapestries. However, she placed a Jean-Michel Franck table paved in glittering gypsum. Here's a Giacometti table in front of the window, balanced by a pair of chairs. This is another picture taken at a different date of the living room. You can see the symmetry, placement of a pair of antique pedestal tables that support a pair of Giacometti, or actually Jean-Michel Franck lamps. But for a touch of color, she used coral on some of the pillows and on some of the armchairs. Well, connected to the living room are two of the most legendary interiors created by Mrs. Elkins, the Zellerbach card room and bar. The card room, which also is in original condition today, was all done in bleached oak. You can see Myron Oliver made a set of the spiderback or shepherd's crook chairs. They're upholstered in a pale gray leather, as are the pair of tufted corner banquettes. The game table was also made by Myron Oliver. This is all in bleached oak. And the Guéridon tables are by Jean-Michel Franck, and the sconces are by Giacometti. Well, the accompanying bar, for those of you who might have seen the article on Mrs. Elkins in the New York Times Design Magazine, Sunday Design Magazine, about a month ago, this was one of the featured full-page photographs. The bench here was actually styled after a garden bench, a slatted garden bench designed by Chanot, who is Jean-Michel Franck's partner. Frances liked the design so much, she gave it to Myron Oliver, and she said, "I want it to be upholstered in leather, and I want it to be used on the inside." So he did it with an oak apron, and it was upholstered in the pale gray leather. The stools as well were copied from originals that Frances saw in a restaurant in Paris. And the Giacometti table was in sandblasted oak, and the Steuben custom made these penguins for the Zellerbachs. The second floor of the house, this is Mrs. Zellerbach's dressing room, also a new picture. Again, here we are back to that common ordinary Steuben glass collection molding. The wallpaper is matte silver. Again, this is all original to 1937. This is a Salviati I mentioned earlier. Frances spent a month in Venice every summer. She rented a palazzo there. She entertained her international friends there. She did a lot of work with Salviati. There was a private room on the second floor that Frances Elkins was allowed to go up there for hours on end and design things for her commissions. Well, one of the things that she designed was this chandelier in the form of a flower. What you can't see is that it is assembled with thousands and thousands of miniature Venetian glass beads. It took almost 2 years to make this chandelier. And Frances was one of Salviati's greatest customers. Salviati is still in business today, but of course it's very different than it was in her day. Well, the accompanying bathroom, Mrs. Zellerbach's bathroom, you can see a similar hand-painted wallpaper to Mrs. Reed's guest bathroom in the sepia chinoiserie. The baseboard and the tub recess are an luminescent silver tile. The floor is cork, and of course we're back to that awful view again. And for those of you who will accept a little bit of risque, Mrs. Zellerbach, who was a very elegant, commanding lady, she was especially proud when her husband was ambassador to Italy under President Eisenhower, loved to tell her friends at Bridge that she had the best view of the city from her toilet. In 1939, Frances Elkins was asked to do the Yerba Buena Club for women at the World's Fair on Treasure Island. Now, Francis's reputation had spread to San Francisco. A lot of her Pebble Beach clients lived in San Francisco. Well, when she did the club, her reputation soared, and people were standing in line. People of prominence were standing in line waiting for her to do their houses. Well, she did the lounge in cobalt blue and white. She designed these Victorian settees. The carpet is a geometric blue and white. The shells, she had her crew gather these shells from the coastline of California. Her chief workman, principal designer, was Lee Dix. He assembled them on the wall, and they were washed in plaster. Well, Francis loved plaster, and she often couldn't find the right piece for the right spot. So she had plaster chests that were cast. These would weigh a 200-foot yacht. They appeared in many of her designs, and they were just faux commodes cast in plaster. Eugenia McComas, whose pseudonym was Jean Francis, Eugenia being the portraitist of Francis at the beginning, was asked by House and Garden in 1939 to do sketches of some of Mrs. Elkins' rooms for House and Garden. So here is a caricature of the room we just saw in black and white. You see the Victorian settee and a feeling for the color scheme with the bold blue and white striped blinds, curtains and screen. The members' dining room was arresting. The ceiling height, this overlooked the bay. The curtains are a bold blue and white stripe, and the wall covering was a vibrant mustard yellow velvet that billowed from the ceiling. The Jean-Michel Franck style table and chairs. The chairs were upholstered in red. This is a close-up of the cocktail balcony, the spiral staircase that ascended to the balcony. The standing lamps are renditions of a Giacometti lamp. One of Mrs. Elkins' clients, when I interviewed her, had just celebrated her 100th birthday in California, and there are a couple Elkins clients still living, and they're pretty sharp. And I always love it when somebody who's 100 years old said, I've used every decorator in San Francisco in my lifetime. Nobody came up to Francis Elkins. Well, this particular client loved these chairs so much that after the fair closed, she and her husband purchased a set of 12 of them for their dining room. Francis was decorating their dining room in Hillsborough, and the dining room was done in pale shades of celadon. So Francis reupholstered the chairs in leather, and she had the leather dyed celadon. Well, Mrs. Henderson said everything was fine until we had our first black tie dinner, and all the men stood up and they had green dye on their pants. So she said Mrs. Elkins, without an argument, took the chairs back and just put natural leather on them. This is a rendition, another Eugenia McComas rendition of the dining room. You can see the vibrancy of the color. The second floor gallery, the walls were covered in silver tea paper. The oversized settees were upholstered in what was called a gold fabricoid, which was a plastic material. The tables were sheathed in silver and gold tablecloths. And of course, here you see another plaster chest, which she covered in silver and gold. Of course, this was a club, and Francis wanted the members to have fun. She wanted them to enjoy themselves. She knew that nobody would be living in this space, so it was all for fun and frivolity. Well, once the fair opened, people like Rosalie Myers Stern, who is a very prominent civic and social leader in San Francisco. She was the sister of Eugene Meyer, publisher of the Washington Post, father of Katharine Graham. She saw Francis Elkins' work, and she signed her up. Not only did she sign her up as the family decorator, but the Stern Haas family from Levi Strauss, which was her daughter's family, married family, used Francis Elkins for 3 generations. The only surviving Haas client of Mrs. Elkins is Richard Goldman. He's the great-grandson-in-law of Rosalie Stern, and he's in his middle 80s, and he said, when I married into my wife's family, we came back from our honeymoon, we were designing this wonderful Esherick house in Presidio Heights, and Mrs. Elkins just showed up. It was just understood that she was going to do the decorating. She came with the family. Well, at that time, Mrs. Stern's granddaughter, Rhoda Haas, who became Rhoda Haas Goldman, was about to attend UC Berkeley. Well, there were no dormitories for women at UC Berkeley. Well, at that time, Mrs. Stern was going to endow a residence hall in memory of her late husband, Sigmund Stern, who was the president of Levi Strauss, and her son-in-law, Walter Haas, persuaded her to give the money for the first women's dorm at UC Berkeley, ensuring that 90 women would have a place to live and that her granddaughter would have a suitable place to live for 4 years while at UC Berkeley. Well, of course, this coincided with the World's Fair, so she hired Mrs. Elkins to design Stern Hall, down to the silverware in the drawers. William Worcester, the Bay Area modernist who designed also the Yerba Buena Club, designed Stern Hall. Rosalie Stern wrote Mr. Worcester and said, everything in this building is to pass through Mrs. Elkins. She has the final say down to the nails you use in the walls. She also told Mrs. Elkins, when you do the dorm, I want you to do it with the utmost of style, the utmost of taste, and the budget is to be no different than if you were doing my own house. So Francis, who was spending a great deal of time in Mexico at this period, did the living room or the drawing room in Mexican moderne. The floors were paved in a polished concrete that had been painted charcoal gray. The lamps, the tables, the lounging chairs came from Mexico. The tables and the chairs were upholstered in a dark tan rawhide. You see the cowskin rugs. The sofas and armchairs were upholstered in a beige fabric woven by the great textile designer Dorothy Liebes. Dorothy was based in San Francisco. She was just another one of the great artisans of this period that Francis befriended. They all learned from each other. They all helped each other. The walls in this room are bleached Philippine mahogany. The sconces, as well as the mirror frame, is wrought tin from Mexico. I interviewed probably 15 women who lived in this dorm over the course of many, many years, and they said since living in Stern Hall, life had never been as good. The dining room, where the women were served every night, this was service. This was not buffet. The women said we sat in this room and we were waited on by male hashers or students who were earning extra money to put themselves through college. Well, Frances's reputation also spread south to Los Angeles. She started to get calls from people like Louis B. Meyer, David Selznick, and Edward G. Robinson. Well, when David heard this, he absolutely forbade her to go to Los Angeles, saying to her, we don't work for those types of people, Frances. And she said, okay. And of course, the next day she was in LA discussing with Edward and Gladys Robinson how they wanted their house done in Beverly Hills. Well, the Robinsons had a great collection of French Impressionist paintings. Well, of course, Frances was astute enough to know to design the rooms, the living room, so as not to compete with the museum quality collection. She kept the color scheme into muted beiges and celadons. She selected museum quality furnishings, Hepplewhite and Chippendale pieces. However, when she did the Robinson card room or loggia, now this picture is from 1947. This room would be in vogue today. The Robinsons also collected African art, African sculpture. So she decided to ebonize all the wood in this room, the furniture, the flooring, the doors, to complement the patina of the African sculpture. Then she asked Dorothy Liebes to weave her this vibrant cyclamen pink fabric for the furniture. Now, the furniture was made by Myron Oliver, all in the style of Jean-Michel Franck. In Pebble Beach, another one of Mrs. Elkins' early clients was Elizabeth and George Coleman. The Colemans had struck it wealth rich in oil in Kansas. They moved to Pebble Beach, and they knew that if they wanted any sense of style or prominence, they needed Frances Elkins as their decorator. So they signed her up, and of course they absolutely came to Pebble Beach with nothing but a desk. Frances loved that, and of course she also, Mrs. Coleman and Frances both loved the blue and white and yellow, so she used the hand block linen from Germany for the sofas. This is the corner of what was the gondola chair. Frances was in Venice one time, and she was riding a gondola, and she realized that she could do a much better job at designing a perfect chair for a gondola. So she purchased one of the original chairs, she shipped it back to Quigley, and together they improved the gondola chair that's been used in Venice for hundreds of years. Well, it was used a great deal in her interiors as a pull-up chair, so you can see right here the corner of one. Three other craftspeople that Frances used a great deal of in Carmel or Monterey were the Bruton sisters, Helen, Esther, and forget the third name, excuse me. They were trained by the craftsmen that William Randolph Hearst brought from Italy to do the mosaics at San Simeon. They did terrazzo-topped tables. Here's sort of an abstract Miro-esque terrazzo-top table in the shades of blue, white, and yellow, and it's set into a crackled white frame. And for a bit of punch and vibrancy, the Coleman terrace was furnished in whimsical chairs upholstered in a vibrant poster red material. This was sailcloth. Frances found these antique firebacks in France. She had her people paint them and use steel wool to scour them to enhance their patina. The last house that David Adler designed, and really the only house he designed on a budget, was for his very good friends Ruth and Paul Winslow. Ruth Winslow was hired by Sam Morse when he was starting Pebble Beach to move over from Hawaii and head Del Monte Properties. So Ruth Winslow really sold most of the lots to new home builders who were coming into Pebble Beach. Well, they had no children, and they had bought this piece of property, hillside property overlooking the 17-mile drive, and they asked David to design this house. Well, the house was going up just as David Adler died in 1949. Of course, Frances Elkins was decorating the house, so she had to finish it for her brother. Well, because the house was rather small, David wanted the Winslows to have a living room that was the equivalent of a living room in a larger house. So the epicenter of this house is this very large, spacious living room, double height plank ceiling from Casa Mesti. David and Frances did not want to use this boring, narrow width plank flooring, so they used 9-inch wide pine planks indigenous to the region, and they put a star in the center and a polished walnut. Well, of course, this was unheard of. To put antique furniture on this primitive flooring was very, very daring at that time. Again, you see the Giacometti lamps. You see the symmetry and arrangement of furnishings, the Queen Anne mirrors, the Chippendale console tables, and a pair of Giacometti bowls. Another sitting area in the living room was also anchored by a rug. There were a pair of rugs in this room that Frances designed and had made in Kentucky. These are tobacco leaves and shades of green, yellow, and white set on a cocoa or chocolate brown ground. Adler's idea was to hang the painting, a portrait, up high because he wanted the visitors to be forced to look up and enjoy the ceiling and the height of the room. Here you see a preview of one of Mrs. Elkins' most daring and bold dining rooms, called the Red Dining Room for obvious reasons. She went to Mexico and she brought back $1 a yard Mexican hop sacking. She upholstered the walls in this hop sacking, using it for the curtains, the trim on the curtains, as well as the ceiling line and the baseboard was a black and white braided trim. The chandelier was purchased by Frances in Venice. The mezzotints are English. The funny story about these mezzotints is Frances was famous for putting things on memo or on approval for her clients. And occasionally she got absent-minded and she forgot to bill the clients for the items. Well, Frances died in 1953. Ruth Winslow died in 1989. And in her will, she left the mezzotints to Francis Elkins' heir, grandson David Boyd, saying, "Your grandmother never billed me for these mezzotints." Now, this is a photograph taken in 1984. You can see that the red has turned a rust color. But again, when Ruth Winslow died in 1989, she touched nothing in the house. The Haas apartment, this was Elise Stern Haas's an penthouse apartment in San Francisco, second generation of the Haas family. Again, Frances knew not to compete with the view. The room is dominated by teal gray. She had touches of coral in the pillows and the benches, but you see the view was the most important factor in this room. Dorothy Liebes, who wove the fabrics in the Edward G. Robinson House and Stern Hall, also did magnificent bamboo blinds. She also used them in the dining room, and the glittering material is lurex, which is a metal yarn. Again, Frances kept the color scheme in the dining room rather muted because of the view, but adding the touch of the avant-garde with the Giacometti ceiling fixture. Gardner Daly was another modernist who did a lot of work with Mrs. Elkins in San Francisco. David Adler could not stand his work. He forbade his sister to work with Gardner Daly, and again, Frances is okay, and then of course she did a lot of houses with Gardner Daly. This house is perched on the pinnacle of Pacific Heights on Fillmore Street. It was purchased in the 1940s by Louis and Jane Lapham. The Laphams were very good friends of Mrs. Elkins, and of course the house is extremely modern and anything but inside. Frances, who had a propensity for the Far Eastern influence, she found this oriental rug in colors of crimson and cafe au lait, and she derived the color scheme of this room accordingly. Also, the Chinese painting, this is a silk on, it's watercolor on silk, ancestral portrait, the Coromandel screen, the gilded Jean-Michel Franck lamp, or actually Giacometti lamp on the antique table. Another view of the living room, the French provincial coffee table, the cafe au lait walls, and the cocoa-colored silk draperies. Mrs. Elkins' last commission, also a Gardner Daly house, was also on Broadway, several blocks east of the Zellerbach House, with a similar view of the bay, was by Gardner Daly. It was for Irma and Al Schlesinger. And for those of you who were familiar with Nan Kempner, the socialite who just died in New York, Nan Kempner was the daughter of Al and Irma Schlesinger. Well, Nan was very helpful to me because I interviewed her many, many times, and she said to me, you know, my mother Irma was, you know, the most stylish woman in San Francisco. She was also one of the most difficult, assured women of the city. She said the only person she met her match in was with Mrs. Elkins. They used to fight it out. They thought that there was going to be death in the living room when they were fighting over what was going to go into the room. Well, of course, Frances usually won the fight. Well, when the Schlesingers hired her, the Schlesingers were very avant-garde, and the house reflected their personalities. The entrance hall on the first floor was paved in a black terrazzo. The albatrosses are by Giacometti. They are plastered. They were inset into the wall. The spiral staircase ascended 2 more floors. The runner was in a bold red. The living room with its spectacular view of the Golden Gate Bridge. The rug is an antique Gros Point in colors of black, turquoise, and gold. It established the color scheme for the room. The Adam armchairs were gilded and upholstered in a shiny black leather. They were very rare. Here you see another Bruton Sisters coffee table, which was in a glittering golden mosaic. And then the curtains, which were in a plush red velvet that Nan Kempner said had to be hung and rehung until they hung perfectly on the floor. Another view of the living room. The sofas are upholstered in a pale pink and silk linen. You see an 18th century leather screen, another set of the Adam armchairs. This is an Adam settee that was upholstered in a luminescent red. You can get a better view of the rug here, the Chinese commode. This is the dining room. Dorothy Liebes wove the fabrics for the banquette. This was in gold, white, and black. The teak floors that paved the whole second floor of the house in the dining room, they were incised with a brass band. And the elaborate version of the Giacometti palms served as the base for a pair of console tables, or buffet tables, and lamp, and the plaster pilasters. The curtains are an off-white linen. This is a photograph of Mrs. Elkins in the late 40s at her Fisherman's Wharf studio in Monterey. At first, Frances worked out of her house. Then she set up an office in 1927 in the Robert Louis Stevenson House in Monterey. Shortly, about 20 years after that, the city took over the house and made it a national treasure. So Frances went out to Fisherman's Wharf, and she rented a corrugated tin warehouse. The flooring inside the warehouse had separated. You could see the fish swimming by. It was very seasoned and raw and primitive, and Frances loved that. She had a great sense of humor. She was very chummy with the native fishermen who spoke mostly Italian, very little English. She had a very dry sense of humor. She could just as easily be seen standing on the wharf, dressed in Chanel, talking to these fishermen while they were sitting by fishing, trading jokes, and dirty jokes at that. Well, the warehouse she painted the exterior in a turquoise. She put plywood on top of the plank flooring for safety factors, and she just brought in her pieces, her desk, the French provincial commode, her fabric, her Giacometti plaster pieces. This is a standing lamp by another great designer from Europe, Serge Roche. The shades are in scarlet red, and she had a very good time on the wharf. When Frances Elkins died in 1950, there was only 4 years after her brother. I just would like to read, in closing, I would just like to read something that just summarizes how she was worshipped and revered in the design field. During the 5 decades since Frances Elkins' death, she has been fittingly revered as one of the 20th century's most legendary decorators. Through her great taste and innate ability, she revolutionized the field of interior decorating. Her example inspired numerous eminent successors. Billy Baldwin, the late dean of 20th century design, believed that, quote, she was perhaps the most creative decorator we ever had, and continually followed her credo of elegant simplicity. Michael Taylor, the San Francisco decorator, the subject of my next book actually, who purchased a significant portion of Elkins' estate, repeatedly factored her eclecticism and technique of complementary paired colors, as well as the influence of Franck and Giacometti into his interiors. Like Baldwin, Taylor idolized Elkins, emphatically proclaiming in a 1984 Connoisseur magazine article that, quote, her genius was doing it when she did. Thank you very much.
You are all invited to the Lasker Estate, and I think Jim Herbert wants to say a few words.
I would like to say what a great program it was, and I want to thank Jan for arranging this, but that's not enough. All of the programs that the foundation has enjoyed, not only the programs, but all of the houses that we anticipate in the oncoming year and for the last several years have all been attributable to Jan. It's all the more amazing when you think that she gets on the train at 7:30 in the morning and rides home on the 6 o'clock. She enters the commercial world in Chicago. When you see her tonight at the reception, will you please give her our thanks?